Good afternoon, MBA 515. Hope everybody's having a great day and getting a little studying on this Mother's Day. Well, today I'd like to wrap up our network diagramming and critical path analysis coursework with a final review of the forward and backward pass, as well as an attempt to identify and see what exactly is the critical path. Well, first of all, let's take a look at the network diagram that I produced for you today. I've actually done a forward pass and a backward pass and generated the calculations for you. For some of you that are struggling with this, take a good time right now for you to go through, maybe hit the pause button and do that forward pass and backward pass and look at my calcs just to make sure that if you're just not certain of your confidence in doing this, just to go back and do the calculations and utilize the table that I've got up here and just say to yourself, early start, late finish, early finish, etc., as you go through the calculations, just to get kind of in your brain this idea of what is the early start, what is the early finish, what is the late start, what is the late finish of each of your activities that are part of the network diagram. So now when we think about critical path, one thing we need to understand is that in identifying the critical path, we need to know what is meant by float. And float is also called slack as well. So when you hear the terms float or slack, you're really looking at the time that is an additional amount of time that can be used by an activity to get done. And so when you hear about a activity having float, it is essentially going to be on a non-critical path. So if you look at our particular network diagram, you see three activities that actually carry float. One of those activities is activity B, and when you calculate float, you're taking the late finish and you're subtracting from that late finish day the early finish day. Now, in my particular example here on this particular network, I've got the unit of measure being days. So if we were to take activity B, for instance, and look at the late finish date, and that would be day 8. Subtracting the early finish date of 7 is basically telling me that I've got a float for that activity of a single day. And you can do the same calculation. You're going to get the same answer if you use the late start and the early start dates. You're going to get the same amount of float with that calculation. And for us in this case, it is going to be activity B having 1 day of float. Now, what is float? Well, the logic is, and think about it, is that if the activity, which in this case B, could start at the very beginning, which is day 0 into and through day 1, but it doesn't, that's okay. It can start the next day. But note that if it does start the next day, it likely will become part of the critical path. So think about that for a moment and ask yourself, how would that be the case? And then we'll get back to that. If you look at activity C and do the same calculations, you'll see late finish less early finish, which is day 20 less day 11. You're going to have a float of 9 days. You go to activity F and do the same calc, but do it with the late start and early start dates. You'll find that you will have the same amount of float in that activity F, and so the calc being the late start of day 20 less the early start of day 11, giving you that float of 9 days. So what's interesting when you think about those activities that have float, well, we know they're not critical. Okay? So then what is critical? Well, critical is going to be those activities that have 0 float. So in essence, your critical path is going to be the string of activities in your network diagram that have 0 float. That is essentially saying that your late finish less your early finish is 0. That your late start thus your early start for that activity is 0. There is no room to play. There is no float. There is no slack in those activities. Thus, that makes them critical. So in this particular case, when you look at this network diagram, your critical path, and as you can see, I've got it up there noted already in orange, is A, D, G, and E. Each one of those activities has 0 float. And so when you think about the critical path and what it means to have 0 float, well, what that means is that that particular pathway through your network diagram is going to be the longest path through your network. And saying that it's the longest path means that it's going to show you the shortest total duration that you could complete that project in. So in this particular case, the shortest duration is going to be our project here finishing on and through day 25. Now, when we think about float, we think about the need for it to be utilized. Many times float is viewed as essentially an asset when you look at your network diagram. And how is that? Well, when you have the float, when you have the slack to work with, then you're able to maybe identify resources that aren't necessarily needed on the pathway of C and F, or for those activities, particularly maybe in C or in F, that may then be able to be utilized somewhere else in the project, perhaps on the critical path. So it allows you to look at the resources that you're utilizing on your non-critical activities and be able to manage those resources in a more effective and efficient way. So that's one reason why to look at the non-critical paths and look at the float that's available on them, as well as to look at your critical path, which really is the main focus, because we know that if there is any type of delay in any of those activities, it's going to impact that path, and it's going to impact that duration of 25, because there is just no float to be utilized in that string of activities. Now, you may ask the question, is there such thing as negative float? And in fact, there is such thing as negative float. When you have negative float tells you that you're going to be behind schedule. Negative float tells you that this duration of 25 is most likely not going to be met, but this duration of 25, if you have negative float, shall be extended. So I want you to think about this, even though I'm not going to analyze it and show it for you on this diagram, is think about where you could have negative float and identify where it could be in your network diagram. And then as a result, when you do have negative float, you need to make it positive. So more than likely, how you do that is part of what you do when you analyze the network diagram. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you think about that tonight. And tomorrow night at lecture, we'll discuss that and see what are the things that we can do in addition to just our overlay view of what the critical path is. What do we do when we see that there are issues against the critical path? And what kind of decisions do we make? And what kind of adjustments should we be looking at when we consider how to get that project back on track in order to meet what was our original target date? And in this particular case, it would have been the duration day, completion date of 25. Well, that's all I have to share with you tonight. Take a look at this network diagram. And as I said earlier, go through the forward and backward passes to make sure that you've got a good feel for it. And then tomorrow night at lecture, we'll talk about some other concepts that are related to the critical path. And those concepts are fast tracking and the idea of crashing. And really what it comes down to is the impact of decisions that may be put upon the project manager from an external source to say that once you've identified your critical path, the external source might say, hey, I need this project to be completed on day 20. Please go back to your network diagram and your critical path analysis and tell me how you can make this day 25 to be 20. So then you go back and you look at your network diagram and you look at the logic and the sequencing that you have. You kind of get an idea of the resources and the impact of the resources, the perhaps lack of resources that you might have, or the ability to acquire further resources to be able to meet, let's say, a date or duration of 20. So we'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow night. And again, like I said, talk about fast tracking and crashing. So buck up on your reading and see if you can find out a little bit more about those concepts. And be prepared for tomorrow night when we wrap up and finish our analysis of critical path. Everybody have a good evening tonight, and we'll see you tomorrow night.